Welcome, friends, to another edition of Economic Update, a weekly program devoted to the economic dimensions of our lives and those of our children. I'm your host, Richard Wolff. I want to quickly remind you that Charlie Fabian, a volunteer who works with us, is ready and willing to take your suggestions for the program, your documents if you have them. That's what he's there to do. It helps us design the program in a way that meets your interests above all else. And I also want to start, before jumping into today's topic, by reminding you that we now have a new book just released called Understanding Capitalism. I wrote it as the third in a 3-volume set. We earlier published Understanding Marxism, then we published Understanding Socialism, and now we publish Understanding Capitalism. I think you'll find it an accessible way to get involved in bringing the problems, the possibilities of capitalism more into your understanding and your work. That's why we wrote it. I think you'll find it worthwhile. And you can find all about it at democracyatwork.info, our website. Today's program is an attempt by me and by Democracy at Work to honor Labor Day, or to be more exact, to honor what Labor Day could and should mean, but too rarely does. And I thought the best way I could introduce it is by reading to you a quotation from President Abraham Lincoln. It's not perhaps the Lincoln you know from the Emancipation Proclamation, his most famous document, and for obvious reasons. It's less well known, also for obvious reasons that you'll understand as I read it to you. It's very short, and I think it's worth pondering. Here we go. It's part of a message delivered to Congress by the then sitting President Lincoln on December 3rd of 1861. So it's well into the American Civil War, which began at the beginning of 1861. So in December, we'd had nearly a year of that Civil War, the most destructive war for Americans in the country's history. Here is what Abraham Lincoln said, quote, "Labor is prior to and independent of capital. Capital is only the fruit of labor, and could never have existed if labor had not first existed. Labor is the superior of capital and deserves much the higher consideration. Capital has its rights, which are as worthy of protection as any other rights." End of quotation. Wow. The President of the United States makes it unambiguously clear that labor is more important than capital, that indeed labor is what creates capital and all wealth. These are the views of the President, and it's important to remember that he makes it during the Civil War. He wants working people to understand that by siding with the Union, as opposed to the Confederacy, you're unifying, you're siding with a social force led by a president, the Union, Abraham Lincoln, who believes that labor, quote, is superior to capital. And now he mentions at the end capital's rights. Well, we know what capital has done with its rights. It has made sure that they understood to include their rights, the right to organize, direct, and fund political parties. And here in the United States, capital has 2 political parties that it's particularly interested in. One is called Republican, and the other one is called Democrat. They also have other parties, smaller ones, like the Libertarians. But the big ones have a monopoly. They have made sure that the little ones stay very, very little and either don't run their own candidates or else run them inside one of the other big parties so that the big parties can keep up their monopoly. It's kind of odd, don't you think, that we have in the United States an antitrust tradition. The Sherman Antitrust Law of 1890, the Clayton Act of 1914, expressly forbids monopolies to exist in our economy. But no one from the Republican or Democratic parties has been able to mount a successful campaign, there've hardly been any campaigns at all, to get rid of the political monopoly exercised by the Republicans and the Democrats, as they calmly and happily trade places. You can be the president this year. No. You do it. Well, I'll do it in 4 years and we'll change it. You have it a while, we'll have it a while. You have the Congress a while, very comfortable. Two parties, nobody else allowed in that club. In contrast, Labor has no party, no political party of its own. No political party that exemplifies and puts into practice what Abraham Lincoln said, that labor is prior to, is superior to, deserves much the greater consideration. Whoa, think a minute. If labor had its own party, then the government would intervene in the economy, not to support profits, but to support wages, because wages are what the majority depend on. Wages are what labor depends on, and wages would be getting the superior consideration to profits, which is what capital is looking for. Wouldn't that be an interesting change? And when have we seen that here in the United States? How about trying never? Why not? We don't have a labor party. There are countries that do. Some of them even call it Labour Party. Britain, for example. Other countries call it socialist parties, anti-capital parties, anti-capitalist party, all kinds of names. The names don't matter much, but they have parties based on at least a verbal commitment to what Abraham Lincoln said. It's sad that a number of those parties with a verbal commitment don't actually do it. But at least in those countries, people like me can hold up statements like those of Abraham Lincoln and call out a party that calls itself the friend of labor, but doesn't behave that way. When you think about it, that's something we could say about the Democratic Party in this country. It has for a long time positioned itself, talked about itself, celebrated itself as the party of the working man and woman. But it doesn't act that way. There was that famous clip that I love to refer to a few years ago when the then head of the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi from California, giving a speech somewhere, was confronted at the end of her speech by a student who very politely said, "What is your feeling about socialism?" The student had been paying attention to Bernie Sanders. And Nancy Pelosi was miffed. She was confused. She didn't know how to give an answer. And so she was silent for 30, 40 seconds, which in the glare of a video camera is a long time. And finally, she gathered herself together and responded to the young man by saying, something like this. I don't know. We're all capitalists now. That's almost an exact quote as best I can remember it. And I think it's wonderfully revealing. And she didn't think she was revealing anything all that momentous. From her face, you could see it. She was just telling you sort of how it is and how it has been, and we're all capitalists now. That's right. The Democratic Party has become the other party of the capitalists, second to the one they already had, which was the Republicans. So why am I telling you all this? Because I think the message, the legacy of Abraham Lincoln is not only the historic Emancipation Proclamation that freed the slaves, but his legacy ought to include also what he had to say about labor being superior to capital and deserving much the greater consideration from the government and from all of us in terms of our respect. To honor labor, to have a special day called Labor Day in order to recognize and honor labor, that's what we ought to do if we're honoring and respecting the legacy of Abraham Lincoln. And what I want to do in the second half of today's program is take a look in depth at what the implications are of really thinking that labor is prior to, is the cause of capital, is therefore the superior of capital, and therefore deserves much the greater consideration. The implications of all of that are momentous. To take Abraham Lincoln seriously in terms of what I just quoted, what he wrote way back in December of 1861, 170 years ago, more or less. Wow. It would mean radically altering the way we run our economy. To make labor superior, to make the employees more important than the employer? Whoa. What would that mean? How would that look? How might it work? Have people already done it? The answer to all of those questions are what we're going to look at in some detail in the second half of today's program. And we're going to begin with this key idea. Before there ever was capital, before there ever was wealth that anybody could point to and say, I own that, that had to be available. It had to exist. Before anyone could make it their own, it had to exist. And in order for it to exist, it required either labor or land or both of them. And that's where it starts. Capital only comes later. We start with labor and land, and that's where the second half of today's program will begin. Stay with us. I think you'll find it very worthwhile. Friends, as you know, any project like this takes money, and we don't want to bore you or burden you. On the other hand, you, our audience, are the source of our funding, and we wouldn't have it any other way. If you can, please consider making a donation. It will be enormously appreciated. Welcome back, friends, to the second half of today's economic update. We're honoring Labor Day, and we're honoring particularly the wise words of Abraham Lincoln with which I began the program. And now I want to unpack, if you like, that quotation that I read to you about the superiority of labor over capital, how capital is produced by labor and reducible to labor. and what that means. And I think you'll be amazed at where we can take this legacy of Lincoln and this way of honoring labor. First, let's take a look at what people think of when they think of capital. Capital is the machinery. Capital is the building. It's all that stuff that the capitalist owns and then makes available to the hired worker to work with. Tools, equipment, all of that. Okay, that's capital. The capitalist proudly says, I bring to the production that goes on in the factory or the office or the store, I bring the capital. I've paid for and purchased the tools, the equipment, the raw materials, all of that. But Lincoln's comment makes us have to remember something. All that the capitalist brings to the table was produced by labor. That capitalist didn't make the desk or the hammer or the machine or any of it. Didn't build the building. His fingernails aren't cracked from working with cement. None of it. The capital brought to the table of the economy by the capitalist, he had to get from, or she, from the workers who produced it. Somehow it had to go from whoever made it, the tool, made the equipment, made the raw material, made the building that they were all in, wired it, constructed it, air conditioned it, everything. That was all labor did all that. So capital is produced by labor. But we all know, and I hope you all do, that laborers and capitalists are not the same people in our economy. And in general, across the world, there's two different groups of people, and they have a name: employer, employee. Are there a few who are on both? Yes, but we don't have to worry about that. That's a tiny minority. Capitalists are over here. They're the people who sit on the board of directors of the corporation, all of that. And the workers, the laborers, the employees are over here. Even the money that the capitalist brings to the table. Let's take a look at that and see how Lincoln clarifies that. What's money? Well, the answer is money by itself is nothing. Once upon a time, money was gold and silver. Then it was something. But then again, of course, the money in the capitalist's hands, if it's gold and silver, reminds us right away, with Lincoln in our minds, a worker produced that silver and gold. It's sitting in the vault of the capitalist, the bars of gold, the mountains of coins of silver. But the gold was brought out of the mine by a worker, by labor. Otherwise, it wouldn't be in the vault of the capitalist. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a coin in the box of the capitalist. So if money is gold and silver, well, then it's the fruit of labor again. But let's do it another way. Nowadays, most money isn't gold and silver. It's pieces of paper. In themselves, as you've probably figured out, worthless. What can you do with the pieces of paper in your wallet? The answer, if you think about it, is that paper is only as valuable as what you can exchange it for. You can use it to buy gold and silver. You can use it to buy a machine. You can use it to buy fill in the blank. Money is as valuable as the goods it can be exchanged for. And what do those depend on? Labor. So what money is worth is determined by labor. It's determined by how many of the fruits of labor you can get for your dollar or your euro or your renminbi or any other currency. Everything is about, labor, which was what Abraham Lincoln wanted us to understand. Well, then what about land? A lot of capitalists say, land. Bill Gates is proud to tell you that not only is he rich with money, but he's the largest owner of land in the United States. Bill Gates, an individual. hundreds of thousands of acres that he's bought. So land, rich capitalists. But now we have an interesting thing. Is land the product of labor? No. If you're religious, land is the product of God. If you're not religious, land is just there by evolution. It was there when this planet broke away from whatever it was part of before. But one thing is clear. Capitalists didn't make the land. They somehow came to own the land, which they never made. So you'd have to believe, if you're religious, that God wanted some people to have land because he gave them a lot, and other people to have none because they don't have any. And they're not happy about it. No, Abraham Lincoln teaches us that the land ended up in the hands of a few, and the wealth of the society, the capital, ended up in the hands of the few. And that the real interesting question is, how'd that come to be? How did some people end up having as their property what they themselves did not produce? And how did it happen that the people who did produce it, produced the tools, equipment, raw materials, buildings, ended up not having what they produced? What an odd arrangement. Some people, the vast majority of the employees, produce it, and a tiny number of people own it. Ditto with the land. Wow. Abraham Lincoln in 1861 knew that was a problem. You know who else knew it was a problem just at the same time and was writing furiously the answer to the question? A man named Karl Marx, a contemporary, who asked himself the same question. And now here's the answer. When you have an economic system in the distant past that's got slavery in it, you can answer the question. Because the slave is what? He's property, like a cow or a horse. And so the people who are masters, that's a small group, who own the slaves, that's a big group, can take from the slaves a good bit of what they make the slaves produce. Sure, they leave a little for the slave, otherwise the slave dies. Food, clothing, and shelter, you got to give the slave to keep the slave alive. But the rest of what the slave produces, the surplus over and above what the slave gets to consume, that's wealth that passes to the master. Bingo, we've answered the question. In slavery, the slaves literally produce what the masters take and keep as their capital. Feudalism is different. Nobody's a slave. How do you get the mass of people who in feudalism are called serfs? How do you get them to deliver wealth to a small number of people called lords? The answer is a deal is struck. The lords say to the serfs, I'm going to protect you. I'm going to take care of you. In exchange, I want you to give me a portion of what you produce. The rest of it you can keep for your family. You can eat and drink and all that. But a portion of it you deliver to me, which I accumulate. And that's how I become a rich lord, and you stay an impoverished serf. For those of you who enjoy the parallel, it's a little bit like that famous racket in the neighborhood when two people come in and tell the local restaurant or dry cleaning establishment, we're here to protect you. We'll be picking up a payment of $200 a week. And the befuddled storekeeper says, what do you mean? Well, why should I give you $200 a week? Well, the answer of the two gentlemen is, it's for protection. And the employer, the little storekeeper says, protection from whom? And the two guys smile and say, from us, you idiot. And that's how Once a week, $200 passes from the candy store owner to those two gentlemen. That happens in every American city as I'm talking to you. And lots of it. So that's how some people end up with a lot. And in our economic system, we have a way of doing the same. Here's how it works. You go to look for a job. You talk with the employer. You and he figure out $25 an hour is what you're going to get. Fine, you're happy. You go home. The employer says, I'm happy too. You know why? Because for every hour that person works, he will be producing more value in whatever it is I set him to do than $25 an hour. He'll produce better quality or better quantity of whatever it is we're producing here, worth maybe $40. But I only have to give him 25. I keep the other 15. That's how I accumulate what I'm going to call profits. I'm going to say this is because I'm a genius, because I know how to set up a business, because I'm a No, it isn't, Jack. It's because that person produces more for you than you pay him. And that's how you use your capital. You know why? Because he has to have a job. He doesn't have any wealth stored up. You do. And that's what you use to make a bargain with him. He has to sell his ability to work in order to survive. You have the wherewithal to buy his ability to work. That's how you accumulate capital. So Abraham Lincoln was right. These systems, slavery, which he abolished in the United States, serfdom, and capitalism, are all ways to take advantage of the unequal distribution of the fruits of labor and the unequal distribution of the land. Doesn't have to be that way. It never had to be that way. What Abraham Lincoln teaches us is, if you see it, say something. It's like that sign in the subways of New York. If you see something suspicious, say something. Adam, from the beginning, saw something and said something. Abraham Lincoln saw something and said something. We all can see it with the help of Abraham Lincoln. The question is, are we going to say something? I just tried to do that. What we need to do is not just say something, but do something. And what we need is a political party ready, willing to speak for labor, to say with Abraham Lincoln, labor is the highest value, way above capital. If we let capital have its political parties, fine. Give them then that right. But don't do it by taking away the right of the working men and women of this country to have their own political party advocating for their needs, which have been neglected because they don't have such a party for way too long. Thank you for your attention, and as always, I look forward to speaking with you again next week.